By late 1943, the Soviets were advancing after Kursk, Americans were established in southern Italy, and Normandy's invasion was underway. In an advanced state of preparation, the Allies began to consider what to do in the event of a German surrender. And what if the Nazi Party were overthrown by a coup? How should they proceed if the new government sought an armistice? It was then that a security committee with American, Soviet, and British members decided that the German capitulation should be recorded in a single document of unconditional surrender. Such a document should be signed by members of the German Armed Forces High Command to avoid a repeat of what happened in 1918 when only civilian members of the government signed the surrender. This fact led to the popular stab-in-the-back myth, which cleared the armed forces of blame for losing World War I. But at that time, not everyone agreed on what would be the best type of surrender. After all, it was still very early. Would a single surrender be possible? Or would a milder armistice be possible? Or maybe not even that. A series of local surrenders by small contingents of forces. The text began to be discussed in January 1944, and its final version was approved on July 28 of that year, including after the failed coup attempt against Hitler in Operation Valkyrie. We'll see it another day. The final text had 3 parts. The first included this preamble. The German government and the German High Command, recognizing the complete defeat of their armed forces on land, sea, and air, hereby announce the unconditional surrender of Germany. The next 2 parts together contained another 14 articles. The second part of the document, covering Articles 1 to 5, addressed the military aspect of the surrender. They should surrender their weapons and everyone should withdraw to the German borders as of December 31, 1937. The third part, with Articles 6 to 12, dealt with the civil aspects of the surrender. That is, how the German government should cease all its activities and unconditionally hand over administrative control of the country to the Allies. The last 2 articles, 13 and 14, detail the date of the surrender and the languages in which the final texts would be available. It seemed that everything was settled, but there, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the 3 major Allied leaders decided that German territory would be divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. They also added the famous clause 12A, which stated that the Allies, the victors, could dismember Germany as they wished to ensure peace and security in the future. And there's more. By late March 1945, the British doubted any German civil authority could establish itself as a leadership. And they proposed a different solution, a unilateral declaration of Germany's surrender, recognizing the Allies' victory over its forces. But in the end, practicality prevailed, and the Allies ended up using a much simpler document with only military implications, very similar to what was used in Caserta during the surrender of the German troops in Italy. So now I'm going to show you how all the Axis forces in Europe surrendered in 1945. It all starts on April 25, 1945, when Italian partisans revolt and take the cities of Milan and Turin. Mussolini tries to escape wearing a German uniform, boarding an anti-aircraft unit convoy that was trying to leave Italian territory for Germany. However, along the way, he is recognized and captured by the partisans. On April 28, Mussolini was executed by firing squad, along with his lover Clara Petacci and some followers. Their bodies were hung upside down at a gas station in Piazza Loreto in downtown Milan. The next day, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of the Liguria Army Group and also Minister of Defense of the Italian Social Republic, surrendered all remaining Italian forces in a ceremony at the Royal Palace of Caserta. On that same April 29th, after a long secret negotiation that would make a great movie, we'll also make an awesome video here on the channel. The plenipotentiaries of the commander of Army Group C, General Heinrich von Wittinghoff, and also SS Oberstgruppenführer Karl Wolff, commander of the SS in Italy, signed the surrender of all German troops in the Italian theater of operations, effective as of May 2nd and before the end of April 29th. We can't forget that it was on this very day that the first major German unit surrendered in the Italian theater of operations. They surrendered specifically to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. The 148th German Division, led by General Otto Prater Pico, surrendered to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Fornovo di Taro. With the war in Italy over, it's time to go north. By mid-April, Germany still maintained a continuous territorial line from Norway through part of the Netherlands, Denmark, its northern coast to the Alps. And it was in this context that the Soviets made their final approach to Berlin with 3 fronts, which is their equivalent term for army group. North of the Soviet position was the 2nd Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky. In the center was the 1st Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and to the south was the 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konya. Since January 1945, Hitler had not left Berlin, and by April, he was already permanently installed in his gigantic bunker beneath the Chancellery. The German defense in the capital was distributed as follows. At the city's north front, the responsibility belonged to Army Group Vistula, led by General Gotthard Heinrichs. South of the capital, Army Group Center, led by Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, was tasked with its defense. And the municipal area of Berlin, the metropolitan area, was renamed the Berlin Defense Area under the command of General Helmut Weidling. The Soviet attack began on April 16th, and right after they took the German defensive lines on the Siloam Hills, the 3 fronts approached the city, opening the artillery barrage against it on April 20th. On the 56th birthday of Hitler, taking a pause in the battle for the city, it was on April 25th that the 2 fronts, Western and Eastern, met for the first time in the small town of Torgau, on the banks of the Elbe River. It was there that American and Soviet soldiers met and celebrated together, even if only for a short time. From then on, all German-occupied territory was permanently cut in 2. Are you enjoying the video? Then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, okay? The Soviet advance against Berlin faces resistance block by block. So they used tanks and heavy artillery against the city, and this eventually ends up destroying all the residential buildings. Soviet artillery also creates a dense and constant curtain of dust hanging in the air, which ends up blocking visibility and adds chaos to the battle. As Zhukov advanced from the east and Konev from the south, both vied for the honor of capturing the Reichskrieg first. The main objective of capturing the city is set by Stalin. This led the 2 fronts to collide and exchange heavy friendly fire, causing many casualties among their own ranks. In the midst of that complete chaos, the Soviets of the 1st Belarusian Front approached the Reichstag on the afternoon of April 30th. That same afternoon, not far from there, beneath the Chancellery, Hitler would commit suicide at 3 o'clock, taking poison and shooting himself in the temple with a pistol. Since Stalin wanted the Reichstag to be captured, on the 1st of May, which was Labor Day, the most important Soviet holiday, Zhukov ordered that the building should be captured at any cost. Still on April 30th, the Soviets attacked the Reichstag against a determined German defense, armed with machine guns on every floor. They spent the night of the 30th clearing, room by room, the German resistance inside the building. In the early morning, Soviet soldier Mikhail Renin climbed onto the Reichstag roof and raised the first Soviet flag. Later, he was awarded the Golden Star of Hero of the Soviet Union for this feat. However, the flag raising done by Renin is not the famous one that we know from the photos and videos that circulated in the world press. That other flag raising in the morning was just a reenactment done for the cameras, even using a much larger flag than the original. And there's something interesting. If you notice, the soldier assisting with the flag raising is wearing 2 wristwatches, one on each arm, showing the great loot that the Soviet troops took in Berlin. With no way to continue resisting, on May 2nd, General Weidling surrendered Berlin to the Soviet forces. Hitler left in his will the designations for his succession. He abolished the position of Führer and separated the leadership of state and government. For the leadership of the state, he appointed Admiral Dönitz as president, and for the leadership of the government, As chancellor, he named his minister of propaganda Josef Goebbels. But since Goebbels committed suicide with his wife on May 2nd, Dönitz remained as the sole leader of what was left of the Third Reich. The admiral was also not in Berlin. He was at his headquarters in Flensburg, a small town right on the border between Germany and Denmark. From there, despite the overall desperate situation, he would keep the government running, trying to buy time so that as many German refugees as possible, coming from the east and fleeing the advance of the Red Army, could reach the British and American lines. Dönitz learned about the Allied plan to split Germany into occupation zones. In this way, he tried to buy as much time as possible by carrying out small regional surrenders of his troops. He thus sent his new Kriegsmarine Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, to meet with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, at his headquarters in the city of Lüneburg. There, at 6:30 p.m. on May 4, 1945, Friedeberg signed the surrender of all German troops in Denmark, the Netherlands, and northwest Germany. Dönitz was determined to authorize the surrender only of those troops who were fighting against the Western Allies. Therefore, on May 5, he authorized the surrender of all German troops in the south of the country and also in Bavaria. He strongly resisted authorizing the surrender of German troops fighting the Soviets, fearing that these troops would rebel and continue fighting illegally, which would strip them of the legal protection of their status as prisoners of war. At 5 p.m. on May 5th, Admiral Friedeberg arrived at the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower, in Reims, France, where he was received by his Chief of Staff, General Walter Beadle-Smith. Friedeberg, he tries to offer them the surrender of all German troops fighting on the Western Front, but Eisenhower refuses. He informs Dönitz that the Supreme Allied Commander is determined to accept only a general and unconditional surrender on all fronts, still trying to buy more time. On the 6th, Dönitz sends General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of the German Armed Forces High Command, to Reims. Jodl tries once again to negotiate a surrender only on the Western Front, but Eisenhower, furious, gives his ultimatum. Either all German forces surrender completely, or he will close the Allied lines to any more refugees coming from the east. With no other options, Dönitz ends up agreeing and authorizes Jodl to sign the final surrender of all German forces. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl then signed the final surrender of all German troops to the Allied forces. General Walter Bedell-Smith, Chief of Staff to General Eisenhower, signed on his behalf, accompanied by Moscow liaison officer General Ivan Susloparov. Susloparov monitored the entire negotiation and ultimately agreed to the terms, signing for the Soviet Union. He forgot to tell Stalin, making Stalin furious and calling Susloparov back to Moscow. And you know that's not a good sign, right? He demanded a new agreement with different terms. Let's see exactly what he said. Today in Reims, a preliminary document of unconditional surrender was signed. The main contribution to this, however, was made by the Soviet people, not by the Allies, and therefore the capitulation must be signed in the presence of the supreme commander of all the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition, not just the supreme commander of the Allied forces. Furthermore, I disagree with the fact that the surrender was not signed in Berlin, which was the center of Nazi aggression. We agreed with the Allies to consider the Reims protocols only as preliminary. Eisenhower agreed to Stalin's terms and a new surrender ceremony was planned for the following day. This time in the old German Army Engineering Building in the Karlshorst district near Berlin. At 10 o'clock, the table was filled with military personnel and the press. The one leading was Marshal Georg Jukow, with English Marshal Arthur Tether by his side, who represented Eisenhower in this act. As witnesses were French General Jean de la Faye de Tassigny and the commander of the American Air Forces in Europe, General Karl Spaatz. All the attention in the hall then turned to the door, from where the German delegation entered, composed of 3 high-ranking officials. Representing the Army was Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Representing the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, and representing the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf. The final and definitive signing of the German surrender to the Allies was done at the end of the night on May 8th. When in Moscow, due to the time zone difference, it was already the early morning of the 9th. That's why Russia celebrates Victory Day on the 9th and not on the 8th, as we do here in the West. Next, the German forces laid down their arms in Norway, in the Courland Pocket on the British Channel Islands, in the French ports of Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and La Rochelle, as well as on the Greek islands of the Dodecanese and in Crete. Some other small German formations continued to resist for a few more days, particularly in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. But these forces finally surrendered, falling silent in Europe in May 1945. Despite all this, Dönitz's government in Flensburg remained active until May 23rd, making contact with submarines around the world, calling them to surrender in Allied ports. On the 23rd, Eisenhower ordered an end to it all and had everyone arrested, including Albert Speer, Karl Dönitz, and Alfred Jodl, who were arrested in the same action. The three of them were then sent to the Nuremberg Tribunal. Victory Day was enthusiastically celebrated throughout Europe and the Americas. The most famous scenes are those of crowds celebrating on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and also the British royal family waving to the crowd from the window of Buckingham Palace in London. On June 24th, the Victory Parade was held for the first time in Red Square in Moscow, a tradition that continues to this day. At that first parade, Joseph Stalin and Dwight Eisenhower were present in a tradition that also continues to this day. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky reviewed the troops while mounted on horseback. This tradition continues today, but now uses cars instead of horses. On that same day, the famous scene also took place where the German battle standards were thrown to the ground in front of Lenin's mausoleum, thus representing the definitive defeat of Nazi Germany. And as a final curiosity, the last German unit to surrender was a meteorological unit of the army, which had been sent to Svalbard in northern Norway. It only surrendered on September 4, 1945, 2 days after the signing of the final Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. So did you like the video? So do this, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll know when I upload new videos. I'll stop here for now. Thanks again for watching, and here's a big hug from SDG.